it's running as a service, so you don't have to start and stop the database server. But if you did install it differently, and you have to manually start and stop the server, of course, you have to make sure the server is running for your application to connect to it, or otherwise, of course, all your connection will fail. When you do that, again, a couple of things about this GUI. I put drop-down lists here just so I can specify different kind of drivers for different databases for my testing. You can put those in there if you want. You can simply have just the one for the MySQL and the URL for this particular project. That's fine. Again, keep in mind that in my examples, I'm running the MySQL server listing on port 3310. The default default port for MySQL is 3306. So in my example, so on the code, particularly that result set table model, it's assuming a 3306 there. Having said that, if you're using my that result set model, table model class that I put out there for you, that class establishes the connection. Okay? So the GUI that we built for that one, where I used that one in the notes, basically the GUI, when you see the GUI and the user enters a command in it, connection has already been made to the database. So there's nothing that the GUI has to do in the sense of making the connection. That was all done by the result set table model. Just the opposite is occurring here in this project. Your GUI has to basically make the connection, okay, because you're producing all the credentials for that here. So your GUI knows when the connection is made by, again, when you enter all this stuff and click connect to the database, this line is going to change. That has to occur, of course, before you enter an SQL command over here. What that means for the result set table model class that I gave you is you got to rebuild the constructor, okay? Because the constructor now is going to be handed the connection. Okay, you're going to give that class the connection to the database. Your GUI has already created that. The rest of what that result set table model class does, you don't have to touch. Okay, because it's basically again dealing with the metadata and the data set, and it's basically producing a JTable that you can just drop into any application. In this case, it's going to drop it into this JPane here. Okay.
Yeah, I have a question. For your project 3 on your URL, is that the name of your table schema and workbench, or is that the name of this, like, the purpose for me is called local database of MySQL?
The name of the database that's built by that script is project 3. So that's the database name. You don't connect to a specific table through the connection. It has to be to a database.
Okay, so like under the workbench, you have like several different databases under the schema.
Right.
Like, I guess the default name is ByteDB.
That other script that it created by DB. That's right.
So I just have to change the ByteDB name to project 3.
No, run the project 3 script.
Yes.
Go up here. You got this script. But anyway, this script here is the one that creates the project 3 database. It creates it, populates the tables, and when you're done with that, you're doing that from the workbench, the project 3 database will appear over there on the screens. You also have a script which has root user commands, and then there's another script that has the client commands in it. So there's 3 separate scripts. Before you actually start doing anything with the database, you need to create it. So that's kind of the first thing you do is run that script.
So after we run the DB script, we have to run the root and client scripts.
You don't have to do them at all in the workbench. You can just do them if you want to see what the results for each of the commands would be. What you're going to do with those scripts actually is you're going to cut and paste the commands out of there into your application window and run them.
So I'm running into a problem where when I actually a syntactical error. It's telling me that my version of MySQL is a syntax error, not to show someone.
A syntax error when you're trying to do what, run the
So I'm
script?
trying to, let's say I copy and paste, update the delete, and give me that error. Like it works with select command to like update, delete, or make it like a change, or whatever it may be. I get a syntactical error.
For one of the commands in these scripts, or just one?
For all of the ones that are not select. So all the ones that are not, all the ones that are updated and delete are missing.
Okay, remember now, when you are doing the processing, going to the side. When you have this command entered here, okay, and the user clicks SQL command, there's essentially, again, three categories of commands that can be executed. The select command or query is the only one that uses the JDBC method execute query. Okay? All other commands have to do execute update. So you have to switch. That is, in other words, when you are calling the result set table model, you're passing this, you need to know whether you're executing an update or whether you're executing a query, execute query command. So you have to make that distinction, okay, on your input. Because if you attempt to execute a query or call the JDBC method execute query, and what's inside the parameters, the command you pass is not a query, it will give you a syntax error. Okay, so yeah, you have to make that distinction. Now, it's in general, of course, since we could theoretically put any SQL command we want in this window, we might have to get a little bit more picky about how we would distinguish what kind of command is coming in. But we are going to be a little bit selective. We're going to assume that our users only entering selects, insert, update to replace the normal kind of DML commands. We're not going to be creating tables and things like that. So it's actually easy to find out whether the command coming in is a query or not, because if it starts with the letter S, that's a select. It's the only SQL command that does that. So you can strip off the first character, you can strip off the first word to know whether you need to execute query or execute update. If it's not an S, everything goes into the execute update function.
If someone else is making changes to the database, is that supposed to refresh or update the result?
You mean if we have two instances of the GUI open at the same time? It would, in the sense that the MySQL database is multi-threaded, so it will take multiple users at the same time. From our point of view, with our application, we don't handle that at the transaction level. That would be the database server itself. So if I were, say, running two instances of our GUI, one person is, say, doing a query on the writers table, and the other instance is updating the writers table. Whether or not the query on the writer table sees the insert from over here will, of course, depend on the order of what happened, but we would not expect this user here to see their table refreshed if their query display came before the insert, before the update. So that's, again, we haven't really gotten to that yet. We will when we get into more enterprise solutions, but the transaction management is, again, there's a property in the database world. It's called the ACID properties. And essentially one of them is that the ACID, A-C-I-D, the I stands for isolation. And what that basically means is that in any transaction operating on the database, the updates they make should be in isolation and is not reflected to other transactions until the updating transaction commits to the database. Because if it does fail, we don't want other transactions to be working with data from a failed transaction. So they're kind of treated in isolation, but again, when the transaction over here that's doing the update commits, it doesn't necessarily mean it's leaving, it's terminating, because the transaction can set commit points. So it might be that we would reflect that at a newer transaction coming in to see the update. So it's all a matter of timing. But in terms of our application, no, we don't have to worry about that.
Some of the Ruby user script or the client scripts that are out there, like I'm looking at command, it's got select all, insert, and select all. Are we going to allow users to put all three of those into one, or are we
No, our command window is a single command at a time. We're not basically executing a script from ours. Those commands that are like that are simply because the command that's sandwiched between the two select stars
Right.
is one that doesn't produce output noise,
Right,
so
we
you
want to
can't see it. So it just kind of shows you what the results are.
Okay.
Normally, you wouldn't expect to see that sequencing like that. So we're just doing it to kind of verify it. Anything else anybody can think of on project 3? Okay, next question then. How is the work with Tomcat coming along? I'm hoping at this point that everybody's gotten Tomcat up and running. Is there anybody who hasn't gotten it installed, who's got problems with it? Huh?
Yeah, so I haven't installed, it's just one, so whenever I follow this person online, and I went to the page, whenever I click the button, I get an error that says stop app, but the folder is nothing or anything.
The resource not found, the 404 error?
Yeah.
Okay, a couple things can occur that if everything is actually set exactly right. One of the most common errors for that is that you've made a change in the internal structure in Tomcat and not reloaded the web app. So you want to go to the Tomcat Manager side of things on the web app that you're working in and just click. You can either stop and start or you can just click the reload, and that will update whatever's going on in there. The other problem sometimes that can occur is if you've compiled a servlet with one version of Java and you've upgraded Java, or you have a Tomcat pointing to a different version of Java, you can get a mismatch in the compiled versions, which will sometimes cause an error. That's less likely to happen. But if you really certain you've got everything up and running, structured right, I guess the best thing is if you've got it on your laptop, you just take a look at it and see what's going on with it. This is one of the problems why I do want you to get started early with this, because when you start dealing with web apps in this kind of an environment, many times when you're working with Java applications, you work with your code and you can see, right in the syntax of the code where something is wrong, or when it starts, when you actually start executing, you can see it works up to a point and it fails, and it's easy to kind of see what happens. With these kind of applications where essentially the Java code is now under the control of the server and the servlet engine, you can have everything almost exactly right, and you're not going to see anything. It's not like you can get part of the way through it. It just will not run. And it leaves you in sometimes kind of a limbo as to where the error is going to be occurring. So most commonly, particularly as you develop things from the start, if you've had a web application with a servlet in it and it's already been running at some point, you've got some servlets working, then the structure is okay. That is your basic folder structure and the naming structure of that convention is okay because you had something running. If you put a new servlet in there now and suddenly that servlet can't be found, it's not accessible, it probably means something is wrong in the web XML, because the deployment descriptor is how it finds what that new servlet is. And if it's not finding it, it's probably there. If it can find it, but you're not seeing the execution of it, then it's more likely actually in the servlet code itself. So it is hard sometimes to debug these kind of applications and then get, unfortunately, just more complicated from here. So it comes a little bit with experience, just doing it a bit. That's one of the reasons why that first example web app, I wanted you to create from the ground up and not give you any of the code, so you're familiar with what you have to do and where the little things can go wrong. And particularly in the XML files, with the various tags, the elements that you have there, if you have something, a mismatch tag or something, it's not like HTML where the browser will probably know what you're doing and still render it okay. The XML has got an error in it, then at that point, basically compilation as far as the servlet engine ceases and just isn't going to find it, so the web app just kind of fails. You can also see that sometimes if there's a really bad error in the web XML and you try to start the web application, it won't start. In other words, it won't show it as running. If you try to start it, it simply will not start, which means something is seriously wrong in the web XML file somewhere. So again, keep going on that. Get that first example web app up and running.
Yes.
I'll start putting some of the stuff in the CNT 4714 web app that we're working on now out there, so you can begin to build up a little bit bigger web app as we go along.
Now, I have a quick question. It might be an idea for the error. Now, when you show the steps for creating the web XML file and then the I noticed that you show a document on Notepad, like a 5 pages before you actually start showing how to create the so I'm thinking maybe I'm copying the pasting the files in the wrong spot. I know on the web info app it's just supposed to be the XML file, right?
Inside the WebINF folder, there will be two files. One will be the web XML file itself, and then there will be a folder which is classes. And the classes folder is the one that has the actual server file, the class files in it themselves.
Okay, I didn't see those steps in here, so it might be the
The
issue.
way I put that together is I was kind of piecing it through, but then if you go to the end of that first set of notes, that's where I show you step by step what's going through. So follow the sequence there is where things are going.
And outside the web info app, is there supposed to be another file, like on the very root of the web app folder?
We're at the same level where WebINF is, will be in general your front end, the form, whatever HTML front end page you have for your web app. In the first example, when all I had there was the welcome servlet.html file, that's the one that's going to be at the top level of the web app.
Okay.
It'll be set at the same level as WebINF.
Okay. I'll try.
Okay, anything else anybody can think of? Okay, well, like I said, keep pushing them on Tomcat, getting that up and running, and get that first example web app going. You have issues, probably for this particularly, troubleshooting. If you don't come and see me, it's probably I'm gonna need some screenshots to see what things look like structure-wise, because otherwise, it's very difficult to debug those kind of things, particularly with email. So what we started looking at then in this set of notes is just more features, more functionality that servlets can provide your web applications. And one of the areas we really want to go into now is as we start to develop enterprise solutions, one of the things we have the problem with is that the HTTP protocol is stateless. It doesn't remember anything. So the personalization of the website or the server remembering what you've done, your history, is not something that we can basically attach to the protocol itself. So cookies, session tracking, these are different mechanisms for basically remembering state of things. And cookies, probably the most commonly used form of this. We'll deal with session tracking a little bit more later on. Session tracking tends to work better in transaction-oriented environments. So when we start talking about JEE, we'll see session tracking in kind of a different light. So cookies and session tracking do exactly the same thing. They do it in a kind of a different way, but it's again basically a way to remember things, to remember state. And we looked at this very simple first example for the cookies, where I just basically wrote a cookie to kind of remember whether the visitor had ever come to this site or not. And one of the things that we did in the talk about the cookies was the cookie expiring, an expiration date. And by default, they have a 1-year expiration. So I made this one actually expire in just 1 minute. So essentially, it's going to remember that you've been here as long as your browser session is going along. If you've been, inside a minute. Outside of a minute, it's going to treat you as a brand new customer because the cookie now expired. And when the server goes to look it up, it says, I don't find a cookie that I wrote here that says you've been here before, so you must be a visitor. So that's kind of what we were seeing here. And this is kind of the end result. When you first come into the site, you first run the servlet, and it says, welcome aboard. That's when the cookie gets written by the server. And now if I come back, to that same servlet within a minute, then it's basically going to remember that I'm there because it looks up the cookie, says, yes, there is a repeat visitor cookie written there, and it just gives me a different message that says, welcome back. But if I do that after a minute, then when it again goes to find the cookie, it says there's no cookie there, so you must be new, and gives you the welcome newcomer message. So to do all this kind of stuff, you have to deal with what you want to put into the cookies. So you're dealing with cookie attributes. So it's again a read and write kind of mechanism on the cookies. The server who is going to store the cookie about something that you're doing will need to set the value or set the attribute values. And the attributes are always name value pairs. Again, they're just text, so you can read them, you can look at them. And what, again, it's going to be on the request object. That means when you try to get the values of them, it's going to be coming from the request that you've made to that particular server. So again, a lot of different methods that you're going to see to deal with cookies. The most common ones in here are that browsers can only return cookies to the same host name that sent the cookies. Okay, you can't just arbitrarily have a server connect to your machine and start reading out random cookies. It has to be one then that they actually wrote there. The age one, again, most systems don't, most servers will not change the age. They'll just leave it at the default of a year. But again, depending on what you're doing, you might want to change or set a specific age on the cookie. You could also deal with secure cookies, meaning, of course, they're only going to be sent across encrypted connections. It's not that the cookie itself is in any way encrypted, it's just the transmission of the cookie is actually encrypted. And then, of course, setting and getting the name, setting the value, getting the value. And then what I started to look at last time was, I was talking a little bit about the difference between a persistent cookie and a session cookie. And again, the difference primarily is when the cookie expires. So persistent cookies, by default, have the normal expiration date of 1 year. They will persist without, regardless of how many sessions you might have with the server or the browser, they will exist for a year. But a session cookie only lasts as long as your current session. You shut the session down, the cookie disappears by default. You cannot make a session cookie persist. Okay? It only lives as long as the session. So I did something similar to the first-time visitor here. I just created 6 cookies. Okay? I made 3 of them persistent cookies, and I made 3 of them session cookies. The persistent cookies, I made their lifetime 15 minutes, just so I had enough time to kind of deal with them a little bit. If you're playing around with this, you might want to set the time a little bit lower so you can see what's going on with it. Maybe not have to wait quite so long, but I had to type some notes too. So in this case, it's kind of similar. I just create the cookies. I create 3 session cookies, and I create 3 persistent cookies in this case. And then I do a little bit with them just so you can kind of see what happens. It's, again, basic front end here that just starts the thing running. I'm using a lot of these little front ends like this just so when you get the code in the CMP47 web app, you see the similarity in the way a lot of these servlets are being executed. There are many other ways you can actually run the servlets. You do not necessarily need a form. In this particular case, the form again is attached to simply this button. There's no parameters going across like we were looking at the other day. So I start the cookie test, and initially, of course, there's no cookies involved. And then basically, once I get things up and running, get the cookies started, then the cookies now exist at this point. Now, what I did was I ran another little web app that I created that has basically just a clock in it, so you can kind of just inset the clock. So you can kind of see what the timing is. You'll have to kind of play around, look at the nodes. You can, again, do the same sort of thing when you get the code here. But you can see all the cookies are now active. We've got the session cookies and the persistent cookies. They're all existing here at this point. So you just notice the time of day. And then what's going to happen here is, oh, this is, this is another shot I put in to just show, in this case, that I ran a repeat visitor thing. So that cookie is also still active in this case. So it was the 1 minute one, but that's just a kind of a shot to show you that, again, there's a lot of cookies that have been going on here. So at this point now, I've come back into the browser. I'm in in this particular case, I started a brand new browser session. I'm within 15 minutes of the first visit. So what has happened, since this is a new browser session, the session cookies expired with the old session. That browser session has terminated. So the session cookies have disappeared, and the only cookies I'm seeing here now are the persistent cookies. Okay? Again, within 15 minutes. I wait even longer this time, and I keep the browser session open. In fact, I actually kept it open overnight. And you'll notice that in this case, when I did that the persistent cookies have now died away because they only lasted 15 minutes, but the browser session is still underway, even though it's persisted overnight. And what I have here are the session cookies. So you want to be, kind of aware of that. That if you set a session, and remember when you're going into the Tomcat Manager, one of the things that's attached to each web app over there on the right-hand side is the timeout on it. It's set at default 30 minutes. What that's basically saying is if the user has not interacted with the servlet in 30 minutes, you're going to terminate their session. Okay? Here you notice that did not happen. The cookies, I kept the session going, and the cookies that are now still in existence in the next day are still session cookies. But I haven't actually done anything with the session. It's just still active, but the persistent cookies died after 15 minutes. Okay. Now, if the persistent cookies had been their normal default 1 year, then they would still be listed there as well, too. So you can kind of see that, just going back to the browser and actually looking at the cookies themselves, you can see what's there. So how do you change the cookie values? That's, of course, the most important part as far as the server is concerned. It wants to write something into this cookie so that it can then read it back on a later time. So the main thing is not just setting the name and the value. A lot of people, when they first do that, they simply set the name and the value attribute of the cookies that they're creating. But you have to make sure that you add the cookie to the response object. In other words, it has to go back to the client's machine to be stored, because that's where the cookie is going to be saved. So just setting the value is not sufficient. You must actually attach it to the response object using the add cookie method to actually get that user's browser to store that cookie for you. Again, you'd also need to reset any other relevant kind of attributes that you want the age and the path where the cookie's going and what the server name is and that sort of thing. But I kind of gave you a little bit more feed for that with this new servlet called client access counts. And what I'm doing in this case is actually modifying the value of the number of times the client has come to the site. So I just put an integer counter in there. The main part here, of course, is to be sure that what you can see is I'm setting the value of the cookie, and then later on, when I deal with the cookie, I don't know why I had it coded out. I shouldn't have left that box in there. You can see in here, this is where I'm actually doing the add cookie part. Take that off so you can see it better. So it's not just setting the value, it's also making sure you get add in there. And then I created a cookie utility thing, basically one that is providing some helper methods. So here's one that's going to get the cookie value, and here's one that's going to actually return the cookie itself, whole cookie object to work with. And again, just a little front end. So when the user clicks this particular servlet to start running, then this is their first time in, so it tells them it's the first visit. As they come back to the refresh the browser, whatever they're doing, coming back to this particular servlet, then this counter is going to be increasing. It's increasing again because of what we're doing back here, where we're adding the count to the number of times that they've been here. So the modification of the cookie that we're doing then is what's keeping that counter going as we move along through that. Session tracking is the other side of how you deal with memory and state. And this is, again, a kind of it can be a fairly complex topic, and when we get into the true EE side of things, you'll see this again in a somewhat different light. But the main problem, again, is the context in which the server is working, so it remembers these kind of things. And the kind of example I usually give for this is you have to know when a user session is terminated. And there's a lot of different ways a user session can actually terminate. And keep in mind that the way we're keeping track of the session is we've got a server sitting out here somewhere in the ether. And we're, as a client, are connected to it. And that server now, through our connection, is trying to keep track of our session. So we have a session now underway. And basically, the server wants to know what's going on with that session, how long it's going to last, what are we going to do with it, and so on. Like I say, an example that gives you maybe a more concrete example of what the server is dealing with is, suppose you go down here to Best Buy, and you start shopping. You take a shopping cart, and you just start loading all sorts of goodies into the cart, pushing them around the store, buying everything you want. And then before you check out, you just park the cart somewhere in the store and walk out of the store. Okay? How long do you suppose the cart's going to sit there in the store with all your stuff in it before some employee decides that, what's this cart doing here with all this stuff in it, and start putting things back on the shelves? You have 5 minutes, half an hour, 2 hours. Will it still be there tomorrow? Probably depends on the store, but that's what the server, if you think of the store as the server, the question is, when is that session going to end? Maybe the reason you left it there is you forgot your credit card in your car, and you just are going to run out to the car and get your credit card and come back in and check out. Okay? You can probably be safe that it'll sit there for a couple of minutes. But if you decide that, well, I just really got hungry, I'm going to go off and eat first, and then come back, and maybe it's going to be 2 hours later, may or may not still be there depending on the store. But if you wait and come back tomorrow or next week, the chances are very high that you're going to have to refill the cart again. Your session has terminated, in other words. Everything in your cart's gone. Well, this is the same sort of thing that the browser is doing with the connection to the server. You're doing an e-commerce shopping now, right? And you start filling up your shopping carts. And then suddenly you just walk away from your terminal. Okay? Session's still going, you didn't shut anything down. Server now is still connected to you, but it says, okay, I haven't seen anything from you for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes. When are we going to shut it down? Well, again, like I just mentioned that a minute ago, in Tomcat, the default is after 30 minutes, if I don't see any activity from you, that's the end of the session. I'm going to terminate. The reason, of course, is that you're tying up resources on the server side. You've got a connection object that's part of the connection pool. It's attached to you, but yet nothing is happening at this point. So the server, at some point, is just going to decide, we're done, and we're going to disconnect. So if you come in at 29 minutes, 59 seconds, and suddenly hit a keystroke, session starts right up and nothing happens. But if you wait 30 minutes and 2 seconds, Tomcat says, no, we've got a new session now, and the old session is gone at this point. So any cookies, for example, that I wanted to write would have been written in as the session terminated. So I don't have, it's a brand new session at this point. So with session tracking, what you have are basically kind of 4 main steps when you're dealing with servlets and session tracking. The first thing is you need to access the session object that's associated with the current request. In other words, the server has a lot of pending requests, a lot of different users are out there connecting to the server. I need to attach or find the one that's dealing with this particular client who I'm talking with. So to do that, I'm going to use an HTTP session object, and I'm of course looking at the request side of that, and the method I need then in this case is a get session. So I'm getting the session associated with that current request object that's coming through. There'll be all sorts of information again associated with that session object. I will get the attributes of the session using this sort of a method. And again, appropriate return values and types and whether the results are null, all that kind of stuff can be checked once I know what the attributes of the session are. If I'm going to store anything into the session object, then I would use the set attribute. And again, it's going to be a key or name value pair that I'm going to have to write in. And then eventually the session object will no longer be of any value. Either I, as a server, have decided that that's the end, we're going to terminate it, or we concluded our transaction and the user has terminated the session. We can remove attributes to simply discard a specific value. The time of the session, say, is the one we want to discard. We can do that on a specific attribute. Or we can call invalidate, which essentially discards the entire session. This is what Tomcat would basically invoke on a timeout of 30 minutes. It would just invalidate the entire session. And it would also then generate a log out to the client saying that we're also severing the connection, not just the session. So everything is associated with that session is gone at that point. Now again, there's a difference between a browser session and a server session. Session tracking by default is based on cookies. And so it uses cookies as a mechanism to store it. Again, it's in the browser's memory, it's not written to disk. But unless there's an explicit servlet that reads an incoming, what's called a JSession ID cookie, and sets it all back out, if it doesn't do that, then the session is basically broken and the client would not be able to read the session object again. In other words, I log out, okay, shut everything down, and come back in, new session by default. On the other hand, if I set a session JID cookie, then what I can do with that is write all that session information into the cookie and then pick that up by reading that cookie on the subsequent restart. And that can reinitiate the session. That would be a server session, a continuation of the server session. If I shut everything down from the browser and I don't want the session to restart, then it's just a browser session that is terminated at that point. Again, the big problem from the server point of view is that generally there's no way of telling it when you shut the browser down. If you're, again, connected to Amazon and you just shut off your browser, Amazon doesn't know that you have disconnected from the browser. The browser is not the connection at that point. So it's again kind of difficult to understand. This is where I was talking about the like going down to Best Buy. So you have to decide how long do you wait. And again, the general timeout that most servers will use is generally around half an hour. But you don't want to get too quick because again, that doesn't give the user enough time. If, say you set it in 3 minutes, they might be just sitting there looking at the object saying, I want to buy it or not, kind of thing. And you shut it down on them too quickly. But again, you don't want to go too long because maybe, after 20 minutes, they've already left anyway. If you wait for another hour, still nothing happens and you just tied up all those resources. So it's pretty common to see a half an hour on e-commerce types scenarios for this. But again, you can always vary that. You can decide. And that's one of the things I can show you again there on Tomcat. If you have a particular server, a particular web app in general, that you want to, for some reason, either greatly restrict that or give them more time, then you can set the time out on the session and you can decide what's going to happen. So the last example in this part of the notes then is one that actually uses the session ID, keeps things going like that. You'll see it when I get created here. This is essentially the JSession ID. Here you can see it's just a big long text string, but it's again a unique session ID. It shows the time that the session object was created, and then the last time we came in and accessed it, as well as the number of previous times. I also keep the counter going. So this starts up the new session, and we've got now the session ID created. We'll come back at some point during this time. You can see that, again, the session ID is not changing, nor is the creation time, so we're always dealing with the same session. We're just recording the last time we actually accessed the session object, and of course then the number of times that we've actually come back and forth to this. So when you're playing around with this one, you'll now see a JSession ID cookie appear in your localhost cookies as well. And that gives you that flexibility then of essentially restarting or keeping a session object going over some period of time. This is essentially how Amazon can, of course, remember what's in your shopping cart over, you don't just put in and everything clears out, it'll store things in there. So it just reads it back then, and this again is a much longer time of return again. One more time as incremented here, again, we're still seeing the same original session ID, same original creation time, so we know we're still dealing with the same object. And then here would be when I start, in this case, to kind of show you, again, a little bit difference here. This is even in a different browser, okay? Not even the same browser was used. So this time I switched to Safari. And you can see that now that this is a new user, new session, everything starts fresh, new time of creation, new session ID, and so on. And again, we'll restart for that. So it is a different session with a different user, with a different ID, and so on. So this is kind of the end of the cookie stuff. What I'm going to do in the next and last section of servlets is show you a couple of different things. One is where we return something other than a text type document like a spreadsheet, and also the more complicated cases where we connect to a database and use the servlet to actually manipulate the database. So that would be a true 3-tier application we'll be looking at through Tomcat. That will be very similar to what you're going to do in your next project. So we'll look at that then on Monday. Okay? There should be, again, a TA here on Friday for any kind of assistance anybody wants. If you do come, or if you do plan on coming for Friday to get any help, be sure, kind of treat it like a class. Come, in the first 10 minutes or so, because what I've told the TAs is, if there's not somebody here in the first 10 minutes, they can go back and do their work. So they're not going to sit here for 50 minutes if nobody's here and somebody comes in 5 minutes before class. Okay,
Last Friday we were here on time.
Last Friday, there was supposed to be somebody here and they didn't show and we got in trouble for it too. So they'll be here this week. Okay, see you on Monday.